getting down to rush. So, Harris versus Peterson. I want to start by saying that I'm not keen on the whole versus thing, really. I don't like this being framed in that way. It's an important discussion, and it's something that we've struggled with as a species for as long as we've been a species. During the lineup, there was even one guy who ran up and down the line, like, who you got? Like we were betting on horses or something. This whole attitude just kind of cheapens the discussion. It sets people up in a frame of mind before the show, if they think that way. It makes them cheer for one person, like if they were a sports team. If you ever watch sports, you know how hard it is to be objective. You notice every penalty the opposing team makes, and you don't notice half the crap your own team does. You see the entire proceedings through this biased lens, right? As I got there early, so I had a chance to watch the line from a distance, and I watched it build and build and build, and I was like, well, it's a lot of white guys, I thought. Not exclusively, but sure, a lot. It wasn't really any different than heavy metal shows I've gone to or anything, but I think the media makes me extra sensitive to it or something. Anyways, especially the Harris fans look like metalheads, a lot of them. Nerds, weirdos, real collection of that bunch. Yet the Peterson fans, they seem more straight-laced, They were like ties, Dayton arm, respectable, usually in great shape. I'm not sure how I came off, but I probably looked more like a Harris fan. I'm neither. I'm not keen on being a fan of anyone, just that the word is... Anyways, I was, however, very curious what would happen. I wanted to hear them talk, so I grabbed a beer, took my seat. The wait was insufferable. Some problem with sound, they finally told us, so things didn't start till 8:40. They played interviews with the audience members before the show on this big screen. Some Harris fans and some Peterson fans, and the Harris fans came off, I thought, a lot better in those segments. Anyways, finally the show started. At first there were pleasantries. Weinstein talked about what an honor it was and how important this discussion is, what he saw as his job and how he intended to conduct himself. Harris talked about how he agreed with 90% of what Peterson said and had issues with 10%. He mentioned that since all the conversations he'd heard with him on various other shows were so good that he had to assume the reason their talks didn't work out must be because of him, right? Which was pretty funny. Finally, they gave the mic to Peterson. It's just I may as well get started. And then he got right into it. No pleasantries, no hello, no nice to be here, nothing. It was so oblivious that it was actually pretty funny. He did this all throughout the night. The first thing Peterson did after that was try to build a set of axioms they could both work with. Harris and Peterson went back and forth, slowly building up a world they could agree upon. The plan was to do this until they hit a roadblock of some sort, which didn't take that long. Yet what they did agree on was significant. There were issues with tyranny and freedom, but we did need a moral code that would let us navigate this landscape. It would have to be robust and, if not free from dogma, at least designed in such a way that there are mechanisms in place to replace those dogmatic notions as needed. It was agreed that speech was this mechanism, and therefore freedom of speech was a prime principle, the word, the logos. So the issues boil down to what's right and wrong, good, evil, bad, good. They agreed those things existed, but not quite in the same way. There was a section in Sam's book, The Moral Landscape, that Jordan referred to a lot, where Sam describes two states of being. One is complete misery and everything is difficult, things go wrong, people abuse each other, and that's clearly wrong. And there was another where people were content, treat each other fairly, well-being was a priority, and this was clearly good. And Jordan's claim was that this was not a factual claim from Sam, it was an assumption. That he could simply choose to plant a stake there and call it a fact when it was more like a belief. And Jordan couldn't understand how this was different than creating a hell and a heaven and saying we should aim for the heaven. He claimed that Sam's version didn't take the abstraction deep enough and that Sam pretended like he had a factual claim. He felt that Sam was relying on the stories too, right? The story of the horror and the story of the wonder. Just like a religion does, and that he had to admit that stories were at least part of the answer, the kinds of stories that we get from things like religion. But Sam would not admit it. The bad and good was self-evident, right? Meanwhile, he kept attacking the Bible. He had a lot of complaints, which I would call trite. I'm biased. The same things I heard before, like, oh, they have 10 commandments. Couldn't one of them have been don't own slaves? Complaining that far too much of the Bible was of questionable worth. Some was completely worthless, and only small sections that had real worth. But Peterson would be equally as frustrating to some people. He wouldn't admit that parts of the Bible were clearly wrong. Slavery was a real stickler, for example. Sam said that the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, therefore it clearly isn't good enough as a moral guide. Couldn't Jordan at least admit that that was clearly wrong? And no, he couldn't. Line by line, sure. Paragraph by paragraph, maybe. But as a narrative, no. He said it was like in a movie where the twist ending changes everything that came before. And once you know how that all winds up, then everything you saw before is seen in a new light, right? Sam protested. He said, oh, but slavery is condoned by Christianity for centuries and used to justify it. Sure, Jordan says, but it was the early English Christians that eventually outlawed it, and Sam's like, well, everyone was Christian, right? And Jordan tried to explain that it wasn't just Christians, it was the doctrine itself. If you've ever read the story of Ulade Equiano, you might know something about that. I think it's one of the best of the so-called slave narratives, worth checking out. In any case, maybe it took that long for the culture to understand that love thy neighbor should also clearly mean don't make them a slave. Or maybe Christianity is the only reason slavery stuck around, and it would have been gone if any other religion had been in charge. But I don't think that's Sam's claim either. I think his is that you have to get free from religion because of the dogma. And that's what allows you to progress beyond slavery. Right? But Sam said it was just the dogma, right? Pretty much. And even Brett asked him to clarify that. He was like, well, the other parts he could accept, right? He could see benefits in them. And that was nice to hear. At one point, it got down to God, of course, and Sam had some of the usual complaints about God. It's a ridiculous idea, which it does seem that way a lot of the time, for sure. And he used, these analogies to describe what God would be, but they were cheap analogies. He was making fun of the idea. He was funny, to be fair, right? But Jordan instantly complained and mentioned how the ancient Israelites wouldn't even say God's name and certainly wouldn't describe God, right? He brought up I am, I am, and even talked briefly about the notion that a set definition for God, like many new atheists make fun of, simply doesn't exist. And it wasn't that clear what was meant by God. So Sam called him on it. What is God then? And this was, I think, the best part of the whole show, for me anyways. Jordan read out a list of definitions he'd written down for God right off his laptop, maybe 10 of them or so. I thought they were fantastic. That's the part I can't wait to hear again when this thing finally goes up online. But I can't remember a single one. I had too many beers that day, probably. I don't even know necessarily if they're true, but they read really well. As I read, they sounded great. Brett loved the definitions and even said that he could believe in a God like that. Sam liked them, but felt that Jordan was changing the definition of God. Oh, that's not what these people meant, Jordan. Well, Sam, we don't know what they meant. Maybe they didn't even know what they meant themselves, and maybe they just couldn't articulate it properly, and that's why we work generation after generation to figure this stuff out, because these are real problems. Right? He did mention that sounded a little postmodernist, but to be fair, you could say that the notion of God or gods or whatever the hell you want to see other as is something that humanity has for thousands of years worked over. It predates postmodernism by a long goddamn time. Anyways, the thing is like, I didn't clap all night long, right? There was lots of clapping. But at this point, I kind of wanted to. I loved that part. But I resisted. There was plenty of applause going on already. I found it irritating. It was a distraction. I don't like the carnival, like almost gladiatorial aspect of it. Anyway, sometime around here, it was supposed to be question time, but they just couldn't stop. 2 more minutes, Sam said at one point, as Brett tried to steer them away from the truth issue again. But they did it. They got through, and they kept talking, and question time be damned. Screw it. They skipped questions and kept going. And I was overjoyed. I mean, what do I want to hear strangers talk for, right? These guys are the show. That's what I paid for. So the last bit was mostly about the risen Jesus, what that could mean. And Sam said, I heard you say it would take 40 hours to explain that. And Jordan he agreed pretty much. Said it was impossible. He wasn't even sure that he could answer the question. Sam was quick to do the opposite, of course. How about it is very, very unlikely. I could say that without any issue, which totally fair, right? That is why wouldn't you assume that, right? But Jordan wouldn't do it. He was obstinate. He was in a weird mood all night, and in many ways, even reprimanding the crowd for their applause on occasion here and there, once with words and other times with gestures. I can't blame him. I always find crowds irritating. That's why I don't go to a lot of events, I guess. Anyways, he said that he wasn't sure that a literal resurrection was what they meant. He couldn't answer it without more time. It was too complicated. Personally, I think he's just afraid to reject those things because he isn't sure if there's value in that, and he doesn't want to throw it away until he's figured out what dispensing with the metaphysical is going to do, what effect that has. Anyways, I thought it was a great show. Sam was hilarious throughout and very charming. Jordan was weird and a bit gruff, but still fun to watch. Brett hardly got a word in, but was generally on point when he did. I would have been even more interested in the show if they all had equal time to speak, because I like what Brett had to say as well. And I know I've been a bit hard on Harris in this bit here. I have to admit, I am a little biased. I lean towards theism. I shoot that way. I don't make no supernatural claims. I can't do that. And I've known Sam longer than Jordan, and not personally, but I've read Sam's work for a long time, and I know his stuff pretty well, and I'm pretty well versed in the New Atheists' work in general. So I know that stuff, right? And there's a novel aspect to what Jordan brings to the table. And really, there's a lot of atheists that Jordan could have argued with, just talked with, right? But who's going to take Jordan's spot? It's by far the more difficult position, especially today. Our culture, our education, our understanding of the world, they all subtly push us in an atheistic direction. It's, I think, a natural reaction to the human condition at this point. So it's not that I mean any disrespect to Sam. He's one of my favorites on that topic. I'm just more curious what the hell is going to come out of Jordan's mouth, because he says some truly weird things that I probably wouldn't have thought of on my own. And a lot of them are worth thinking about. When this thing does finally come out, I say check it out. I wish I could have gone again tonight. There was lots more ground to cover, and they both seemed game to do it. That's it.